There are many other techniques you can use to help clients evaluate their thoughts and beliefs. Some of them hit primarily the intellectual level, some more the emotional level, and some really hit both levels. Now I'm going to ask our therapist to talk about some of the techniques that they use with their clients. Okay, next scenario. Same client, therapist learning CBT, and the client has the thought, there's too much to learn. Well, probably you would start with Socratic questioning about that. Or maybe you wouldn't. There are a lot of ways to help clients evaluate and respond to their thoughts. So what are some other ways? There's Socratic questioning, but what else is there?
I could just reflect that I was in the same boat that you were in. That I was in that same situation where I saw there was so much ahead of me, but I was able to break it down into small steps and be able to find it to be much, much more manageable. That I found lots and lots of material that I thought was absolutely overwhelming, but I found that just by breaking it down into small steps, it was much, much more manageable. And I can do two things that way. One, showing that I was in this, that it's a normal thought, it's a normal idea, and that you're not anywhere different for having that idea, and plus showing there's a way out.
So normalizing it. And you also use some self-disclosure there.
Yes.
When you mentioned breaking it down, I often use an analogy of a runner who's embarking on a 26-mile or 42-kilometer marathon. That runner doesn't just set out to do the whole thing. That runner will break it down into small steps and, make a training plan so that they can build on their successes along the way.
So you would provide an analogy, would be
That's
another
right.
possibility.
That's right.
And with that analogy, it kind of brings my mind to expectation. So would that runner expect to be able to do that full distance on the first run? So with this therapist of there's too much to learn, I would be thinking, do they expect to be able to grasp all this expertly after the first get-go, after reading it, after learning for it the first time? So I would try to have them verbalize what their expectations are. And I think as therapists, we tend to have pretty perfectionistic and high standards for ourselves. So I would try to look at, okay, what are those expectations? And then come up with a little bit more reasonable expectations. So what comes to my mind is something like, this first session, I will practice using one therapy technique from CBT while I'm a kind person in the room.
Yeah, and was there, and even in her own history, was there an own point in her own life where expectations were violated, where she thought that she was not going to be able to do something, whether it was a sport or a musical instrument or anything else in her own history, where she was able to overcome her own doubts, see something that was at one point overwhelming and just immensely challenging, and in her own experience being able to do it and break it down and accomplish it.
Oh, that's interesting. So it's actually using herself as a model in previous experiences. What did she learn from that she might be able to apply to this situation?
Yeah, she did it before, she can do it again.
And speaking of models, I might ask her to think of a role model and to imagine that that role model didn't get to be expert from day one, that role model probably had to start from the beginning as well.
And it could be a role model, not as a therapist necessarily, but someone who's made some accomplishments. And where did that person start from, whatever field?
That's right. Teachers, for example, don't set out in the first year in their classroom being expert.
That's right.
And so far we've been focused on the cognitive part. We can also focus on the behavior part. So I would ask, when you have that thought, this is too much to learn, what do you do in terms of your behavior? So they might do something like just stop even trying, stop studying and just give up and go back to their old way of practicing. And then I can use the technique called act as if. So if you were to act as if this wasn't too much to learn, you were capable of learning this, how would your behavior be different? And they might say, oh, well, I'd probably put it into practice more, I'd keep on studying. Because the problem with the behavior of giving up, let's say, all that does is it confirms this idea of it's too much to learn. So if you can act as if you don't believe this, that can also have the cognitive intervention of testing out that thought.
If if your client also had a core belief, I'm not good enough, what kind of strategies might you use to help him with that idea?
So what I could do is I could have them complete a core belief worksheet with me. And what that is I would have that old core belief of I'm not good enough and ask them how much they believe it now, 0 to 100%. I then say, okay, in this last week, what's the most you believe that? And then what's the least you believe that, to see if there's any variation there. I then try to determine, okay, what's a more reasonable core belief as opposed to being just not good enough at all. So the thing with finding that new core belief is you don't want it to be too overly positive. It's not going to be, I'm a absolute success.
And it shouldn't be, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. That's just unrealistic. And the more positive it is, it's not going to be as believable. So we might come up with something like, I'm generally competent. Next, I will look at evidence that goes against the old core belief and supports the new core belief, and I would try to list as much as possible. And then after that, I would look at, okay, what's some evidence that you believe supports the old core belief of not being good enough? And then I would try to find ways to reframe it. So if the therapist says, well, last week I had this client who just abruptly terminated therapy, I might ask, okay, you know, from all the other therapists you know, has that ever happened to them? And they might say, oh, well, yeah, so is that just part of being a therapist then? So I could reframe my client abruptly terminated to, which is part of being a therapist. And then after getting all that, I would then reevaluate what percentage they believe this and see if I had some type of impact. And one additional thing I like to do that's not part of the core belief worksheet though is use a metaphor like, you know, how much do you believe what I'm sitting in right now is a chair? So Fran, how much do you believe this is a chair, 0 to 100%?
100%.
Okay, and tomorrow, given that this chair is still here, how much do you believe it's 0 to 100? How much will you believe it's 0 to 100%?
100%.
So what do you make that your belief in not being good enough really fluctuates day to day, time to time, but your belief in this chair stays consistent? Mm-hmm. So what do you make of that, Fran?
That one is fixed, mm-hmm. and one can vary somewhat.
Yeah, so this mm-hmm. is kind of an objective fact mm-hmm. versus your belief is more of kind of subjective opinion. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You know, I think that's great. And I would just add one thing to what you've said, which is that when you ask clients how much they believe their old core belief, is to ask them not only at an intellectual level, but also how much do they believe it emotionally or in their gut. Mm-hmm. Because usually we find that the intellectual belief changes first before it really changes at the gut level.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Cognitive therapists are often criticized for not taking into consideration history. And that's absolutely not true, especially when we're working on core beliefs. We want to know, when did this start? Are there things in your childhood that you remember where this belief that you weren't good enough began? And I'm thinking of a client of mine who mentioned that she got the smallest bedroom at home, or because she was the youngest, she would get hand-me-down clothing. And she stacks this up as evidence that she just didn't matter as much as her sisters, and she just wasn't good enough. Interesting.
And then she was able to see how perhaps that wasn't accurate when she was a kid and then apply it to today?
That's right, and that would be the next step. First to collect some of that information, and then we can look at it through her eyes today.
So in doing that, you're really looking at the forging ground of that belief, looking about where did it come from and what early experiences kind of set that into motion in the first place. We can also do is even look at the utility of a belief like that. I've had a number of folks, even one I can think of recently, who regarded that idea of not being good enough as being responsible for their success. Yeah, they said that no matter what I do, I tell myself it's not good enough, not good enough, not good enough. And the idea that this will enable them to achieve greater heights and greater achievement. And at that point I can ask, well, what are you seeing me for? What's the downside of having the idea? What price do you pay for coaching yourself with that idea that whatever you do, it's not good enough, not good enough? And then he discovers that he's not able to take advantage of the fruits of his labors. he's not able to appreciate his successes, that he feels that he falls short no matter what he does. Instead of seeing his accomplishments on a scale from 0 to 10 as being an 8, because he expects it to be a 10, he sees that 8 instead as being a -2. And he doesn't appreciate and doesn't take delight in the things that he accomplishes.
You know, that's so interesting. I guess it points out the importance of finding out from clients whether there are any advantages to their holding on to their core belief. Because we certainly tend to look at what are the disadvantages, but sometimes we really need to figure out what those advantages could be.
And it helps us find a way to modify them in such a way that they can keep some of the benefits of that idea and toning down the downsides of it.
So your client was able to learn how to motivate himself without having to say, you're not good enough, you're not good enough.
Yeah, changing the idea that no matter what he does, it's not good enough, to one of, let's say, constant and never-ending improvement. Rather than seeing himself as falling short, seeing his life as one where, in the words of one old saying, that day by day he can get better and better. And he can work towards improvement, not perfection, but improvement in what he does.
Any other strategies you can think of to modify core beliefs?
Yeah, Norman brought up the scale of 0 to 10. Sometimes clients work best visually. So instead of just listing different evidence for belief, they can actually have some type of visual to see how strong their belief is. So you can do something called a cognitive continuum, where you say, okay, 0 to 100, and then draw a line with 2 ends. Here's 0, here's 100. Let's mark yourself in there. How much do you believe that you are not good enough? And have them put a little line and write their name there. And then you can try to get some anchor points. So, okay, what does someone look like who's a 0 on this scale? So, which means, they're basically absolutely good enough. So that could mean they make, a ton of money, they're married, they have lots of friends, all this is going on for them. And then set the other anchor point of, okay, what about someone who's 100% not good enough? What's that look like? And you have them describe exactly what that kind of person would be. And then you try to get more points in there. So maybe something like 50% or 25 or 75% to see what that looks like. And you can also do this with people they know. So who do you know that might be about a 75% on here? And by providing those points, it can kind of adjust how a person thinks of them. Like, oh, well, I originally had myself at 90%, but when I look at 100, and that's someone who never passed a class in their life, can't maintain friends at all, has never had a friend for more than a few weeks, family doesn't talk to them, I'm probably not that far up. I'll put myself at closer to a 60 now. So it helps kind of readjust the way they think about themselves.
One other strategy that I use, although I tend to use it more with clients who have personality disorders, is changing the meaning of some of their early experiences. So I don't know if you've tried this with your clients, but I might find out one of the events that happened to them when they were a child or an adolescent, much as you were talking about before, Fran, where a belief either originated or got strongly maintained, and then work it out with them intellectually. So they have the intellectual understanding that just because they believed it then didn't even mean that it was necessarily 100% true even then, that there were other explanations, other ways of looking at it. And then I might have them use some imagery to pretend they're that younger child or adolescent who's going through the experience. And then I'll do a little cognitive therapy with the younger self. So, younger self, this is happening to you now, so what are you thinking? How are you feeling? What does this mean to you, if it's age appropriate for me to say that? Find out what the beliefs are. And then when this situation is over and they're in kind of feeling like they're in a safer place, I might invite them to have their older self come into the image, and I will facilitate a dialogue between the older self and the younger self. So the younger self really represents that emotional level that still believes that very negative core belief about himself. And the older self kind of represents the intellectual part that understands that there's a whole other way of looking at that. And then I just have the two of them talk to one another so that the younger self can begin to understand better what it is that the older self does understand.
And tell that younger self what she needs to hear at that point?
I think that, yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
and to help her see the reality more clearly. Sometimes I also have to help the older self explain to the younger self that whatever trauma is going on right now will only continue for X amount of time, whichever, whatever is honest. And that in fact, when the younger self is older, the two of them can come to therapy together to get help for this problem.
So really bridging that intellectual and emotional components then.
Yeah.
Another way that we bridge the two is through the intellectual, emotional role play. Have any of you used that?
It can be a dialogue between the head and the heart, or in some cases, the head and the gut.
So tell us how you do that.
I have done that where there can be different sides. I've actually had patients write that as being a dialogue form. Those who are more theatrically inclined and were able to write that script. And I'd say, let's say one side was telling you that you're not good enough, and the other side says basically to, well, for example, dare to be average. Cut 20% off the standards and engage them in dialogue and see if you can bring that to a satisfying, successful conclusion. One side of you may want achievement. One side of you values getting ahead, being successful, making something of your life. And the other side cares for you, wants comfort for you, wants you to be at ease, wants you to be healthy. And how can you reconcile these two sides of yourself in such a way that you can modify that idea between your head and your heart?
So one way of doing that is actually having the client play both roles, either in the session with you or at home writing it out.
Yeah.
Have you ever tried it where you play the intellectual part first and then the client plays the emotional part, and you encourage the client to reveal all of the information, the data he still has that seems to support his belief, such as I'm not good enough, and then you, his intellectual self, answers that back? Have you done that?
Yeah, I've done that before, especially with clients who give me the yes buts. So we'll use Socratic questioning to then evaluate an automatic thought or even a belief too. And they say, yeah, but. So then I'll say, okay, perfect. So I'm going to write down the responses, and then when you have a yes but, write down what your yes but is, or say what your yes but is. So then every time I get a new yes but from them, I reframe it and then see if they can come up with more. So we just keep on going until they can't do any more. And then, like you said, initially I will say the responses, and then we'll flip it to where I will say the original automatic thought or belief, and then they say the responses.
And so doing, we're teaching them right in the session how to get a different perspective, modify thoughts and beliefs, and it can be very powerful.
Here's a summary of what we just talked about, and you'll find this list in the course manual. So now you've heard about a lot of techniques that can be used in evaluating cognitions. Which of these techniques have you already used? Which techniques do you think would be helpful for your clients? What questions do you have about them? Please post on the forum.